Global here for the latest live stream of our Social Change Career Podcast with Alex Budak, who's a social entrepreneur and faculty member at the Berkeley Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, one of the most beautiful campuses in the world. If you haven't been there, I hope you can get there. We do this twice a month on both LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. This is the 9th season of our podcast series. Rotary is currently one of our sponsors, so super thanks to the Rotary Peace Fellowship, which is one of the world's most inspiring professional fellowships that offers full funding for a master's and or professional certificate at one of 8 partner universities around the world. Applications open, I think, February 1st, and they run, I think, through May 15th or May 1st. So I'll share a link to that. And if you are a changemaker and looking to advance your education with one of the best fellowships, please check out the Rotary Peace Fellowship. And also please check out PCDN. We do lots of different things. And one of the things we're promoting currently is we have a career campus, which is helping to convene changemakers around the world. We have about 250 members from 30 countries. So you get weekly office hours, daily email, hundreds of curated opportunities a month. And we also do member-only workshops. So we have one coming up October 6th, Personal Finance for Changemakers. That'll be our next one. And in November, we're doing remote work for social impact. While we're starting, I will summarize Alex's bio, but please let us know where you're watching from, what part of the world, and if you want to share a few words about your background or interest. And Alex, I will summarize, if I read his whole bio, we'd be here the entire session, but Alex is a serial social entrepreneur, faculty member at UC Berkeley, and author of the recent released book from 2 weeks ago, literally, Becoming a Changemaker. So we will definitely integrate the book into this conversation. You can see it up top on our screen. And super congrats, Alex. At Berkeley, Alex created and teaches the transformative course Becoming a Changemaker, similar to the title of his book, and is a lecturer and faculty director for the Berkeley Executive Education Programs. As a social entrepreneur, he co-founded Start Some Good, which is one of the early and leading crowdfunding platforms for social impact. He ran Sweden's most prominent social innovation incubator. We'll have to see if he speaks Swedish, Reach for Change, and also helped Change.org raise over $30 million. And if people don't know, Change.org, it's one of the world's leading platforms that helps convene people around petitions and social action for change. He's giving talks on leadership, entrepreneurship, and change-making around the world, from Cambodia to Ukraine to the Arctic Circle. I'd like to hear about that one. At the White House, UN agencies, and leading companies. So we're delighted that he's taken time out of his busy schedule. On the PCN team, we're based in Medellin, Colombia. So Dr. Rojas, we're having some sound challenges, so she's not joining us as a co-host, but she is on LinkedIn. And Alex is joining us from the Bay Area in California. And so thank you so much for joining. And again, throughout the session, please put your comments and thoughts and questions in the LinkedIn chat box, or if you're on a different channel. And I'll ask questions for a while, but after about 10 or 15 minutes, we'd love to bring in your questions and or comments. So before we get started, just show where people are joining us from. So Chagla, looks like I would guess you're from Turkey. Thanks for joining us. Catalina, thanks for joining us. The PCN team, we have Ivarin from Nigeria, working on diaspora groups and connecting to change-making initiatives, and many other people. So please put your questions and let us know where you're watching from. And so Alex, welcome to the podcast and to this live stream, and thank you for being part of this. And just to start off with, can you talk a little bit about what type of change making, if you had to summarize your career, what's been the change making focus that you've had and where you've been seeking to have the most impact?
First of all, thank you, Craig, for having me. You've interviewed some of my favorite changemakers on this podcast throughout the years, so honored to follow in their footsteps and to join you today. I guess as I think about the changemaker impact that I've tried to have, I come from a place of humility, which is that I can't possibly know exactly what the world needs, but I do know with confidence that the world needs more changemakers. So there's some changemakers that I think take on a very specific slice of change, whether that's education or climate justice. I'm inspired by all those things, but I guess I've always worked at a slightly more macro level. I've always been quite focused on helping everyone step into their changemaker potential. That's what we were inspired to do with Start Some Good, which was an early crowdfunding platform to help social impact initiatives get off the ground, especially early stage social innovators, bridging that crucial gap between that first bit of funding that you need to get started As you mentioned, I had the privilege of running an incubator in Sweden. And again, there it was about building up the ecosystem of changemakers throughout Scandinavia. And then now, of course, at Berkeley, I'm putting on the hat of an educator, a teacher, which feels really right to me as I sort of look back and connect the dots. Everything I do is kind of been a teacher, so it feels really meaningful to do that. But I guess at its core, rather than taking on any one single change, I've always been focused on how can we help more change makers step up and lead change in a way that's true to who they are.
Okay, very cool. And welcome, Jesseline from Florida. I hope the hurricane is not going to impact you too much. We have lots of relatives there, so it's a little bit concerning. Welcome, Minaz from India. So let's see if we have anybody from Europe. So can you, I mean, in your book, you do define change making or change maker. In a lot, you did work at Ashoka, and you talk about Ashoka, and they pioneered, a lot of the early infrastructure and ecosystem around social entrepreneurship comes not only from Ashoka, but they're one of the pioneers. So how does someone know if they're a change maker, and what does it actually mean? Like, because Ashoka used to have the model where it was more selecting fellows, and they still have that model. We have some friends who are fellows. We're doing policy and social impact large-scale change that could affect societies or regions. And then they did pivot to some degree. They still have that model, but now the idea is everyone can be a change maker. So what is change making? Who's a change maker? And is it just that you label yourself, or like what are the indicators of being a change maker?
Yeah, that's right. So I try to bring a really inclusive lens to change making. And we often think of it in the social sector, and there's a role for social sector change makers, but I try to broaden it a little bit as well. As I think about the students that I teach at Berkeley, some of them will go on to work for nonprofits, some for social enterprises, but also many of them will lead change from within more traditional companies or within government sectors. And so I put forward a radically inclusive definition of change making. I simply say that a change maker is someone who leads positive change from where they are. There's no mention of the scale of change. So everywhere from an intrapreneur at a small company all the way to a Nobel Prize winner has a claim to being a change maker. There's no mention of sector or even the type of change. It's an identity that we can layer onto everything else that we do. We can be an artist change maker, an engineer change maker, a leader change maker, a political change maker. There's so many ways we can affect change. And I want to speak to that. In the book, which you were kind enough to mention, I include over 50 case studies of different change makers. And in doing so, I was really deliberate. There's so many leadership books where all the case studies are all about the CEO or the executive director and how they led change. And there's a role for that, and that's helpful. But the stories I tell are of people from all walks of life, people with formal authority, people without formal authority, people who have been leading change for decades. Quite literally, I talk about Dolores Huerta, who's now in her 90s after about 80 years of leading change, and also people who are brand new to it. There's a role for all of us. And so the most important thing I want to put forward is this radically inclusive lens on change making, that each of us can be a change maker, and that I believe each of us can lead positive change from wherever we are.
Thank you so much, and welcome Mark from Belgium and the DRC. And again, other people, please let us know where you're watching from. And in about 2 minutes, also feel free to start putting in your questions or comments because we want to bring them in as much as possible. So one question, this is both for you as a social entrepreneur, a human being, a change maker, and also as somebody who is also teaching, having worked with and accompanied many change makers in the process, but also teaching current and next generation change makers. What would you say are the most vital skill? I mean, there's sectoral knowledge, that's important, but what are the most vital kind of skills apart from sectoral or technical expertise that you would encourage people that they might innately have, or ways to develop them to maximize their chances of really affecting change? And what are the pathways to develop those?
Yeah, I love that question, Craig. Thank you. Change making can feel a little bit fuzzy to some people. And I come from the world of academia, which is all about empirical research, empirical data. So I set out with a partner organization, Eden Strategy, based in Singapore. And we created the first ever longitudinal study to look at how change makers develop over time. We call it the Changemaker Index. You can take a look if you even want to take it yourself. It's changemakerbook.com/index. And there, what we try to do is measure how changemakers develop over time. Students in my UC Berkeley class, they will take it before they take the class, at the end of the class, and then also every year annually following. So we want to see, how do changemakers develop? What are the traits great changemakers have? We break it down into 5 parts, and one of those is changemaker effectiveness. And so we've looked at the data, and I went into it with curiosity, not trying to prove anything, but just trying to answer the question, can people develop as changemakers? And the data are conclusive, absolutely, yes. And there's a couple of trends that we see. There's a couple of key traits that the most effective changemakers have. The first is what we call a sense of agency. So this belief that you can lead change from where you are, that if you see a problem, you can do something about it rather than waiting for someone else to solve it. You feel like, okay, I can actually do something about this. So sense of agency is the first one. And the second one is being able to influence without authority. The traditional model of leadership is that you try to accumulate as much power, prestige, or titles as you can. And then once you've got that, then you deploy that power to try to influence people. But that's kind of an old-fashioned model at this point. Instead, we find that changemakers are very effective at influencing, even if they don't have formal authority. Whether that's starting a social enterprise where you've got to get people to trust you from the very beginning, to trying to lead change across sectors, across roles, to be a network-based leader. Influence is increasingly important. And we find that no matter one's age, controlling for age, whether they're a freshman or an MBA student, that being able to influence without authority is a really key changemaker trait.
So thank you so much. So Catalina from PCDN, unfortunately she couldn't join us because of the sound difficulties. So what are the 3 tips? I mean, what are the most essential things when, whether someone's already active in change making or aspiring to be, what are some tips that you say, build these skills, start here, read this publication, join this group?
Yeah, thanks. And I have the benefit of teaching a 15-week course about it and writing a 300-page book. So I've got a lot to share on this. But I guess if I were to distill it down into one crucial thing, one thing that I think is the essence of being a change maker, it's a concept that I call micro leadership. So we tend to look at leadership through the lens of a single heroic act, Martin Luther King or Gandhi. And most of us will look at them and say, well, that's inspiring, but I'm not naturally extroverted. I'm not as charismatic as them. And I can't do that type of leadership. I guess that means that I'm not a leader myself. I'm not a change maker myself. But I want to change the way we think about leadership. I believe that while leaders might be scarce, leadership is abundant. So leaders, there might only be 1 or 2 CEOs or co-founders in an organization. But leadership as an act is something that we can all take on. And so I think a crucial lesson for changemakers is to stop seeing leadership as a title and instead see it as something that we can practice no matter who we are, where we are. So micro leadership, as I define it, breaks leadership down into its smallest meaningful unit, which is a leadership moment. And if you think about it, there's these leadership moments that appear around us dozens of times per day. It could be being willing to say no when everyone else is saying yes. Maybe it's during a meeting, you notice that one of your colleagues has been kind of quiet and you say, hey, we haven't heard from you. Did you want to share your perspective? Or maybe it's being willing to stay late and be the one person that helps clean up when everyone else isn't. These are all small little acts of leadership on their own. None of these will be the same level of pressure as Martin Luther King or Gandhi, but they're accessible to all of us. And so we start seeing leadership through this lens of micro leadership, that we can start taking action from wherever we are. It changes our perspectives. It starts to give us permission to actually go and lead change. It can make it feel like, wow, I can actually do this.
So thank you. So I'm having my mic on when you're talking, just to avoid any clicking. So it takes me a second. So thank you so much. So there's a question. It's a very specific question from Bineta. Bineta, let us know where you're watching from, but I'll just summarize it. I think this is a question a lot of people have of, and I get a lot of these requests all the time. So basically Bineta saying she's a change maker. She doesn't need to go back to school, but she's looking for support for a nonprofit and looking for suggestions. So I don't want this, I mean, it's a great question, but I don't want to make this just about Bineta. But when you get these kind of inquiries, either as a faculty person, as a mentor, as a social entrepreneur, and someone has, whether it's a for-profit, nonprofit foundation, and they come to you and say, like, I need resources or technical advice. So hopefully this is helpful for Bineta, but how do you respond to those type of inquiries, either in person or when you get a compelling message on LinkedIn or some other channel?
Yeah, thanks. I get plenty of these questions, and I guess there's a couple ways I would go about answering it. The first is when people need funding, of course, I recommend them to go to Start Some Good, which is the crowdfunding platform that we started. We think it's so important to change the way we think about fundraising from being about one person to sit in a room by themselves and look at grants, and instead be about, well, how can a community decide what a community actually needs? It's much more powerful. But separate of that, when it comes to answering questions like this, I think a lot about the power of community. Now, community will be different for every single change maker. And so I won't be so prescriptive to say this is exactly the community that you need. But I think we tend to put the solo, especially social entrepreneur, up on a pedestal and say, wow, they're the hero here. But all change making is a team sport. It needs all of us. And so we need a team and a community around us. I learned this lesson myself. I remember I was fortunate enough to be one of 20 social entrepreneurs, young social entrepreneurs under age 30 that were selected for this fellowship. And we were in Turkey at the time. I distinctly remember I was with this fellowship of people from all around the world, and we could not have been more different. I was from the US, of course. I had new friends from Mexico, Peru, Uganda, South Africa, Poland, Germany, UK, Cambodia, Australia, all around the world. It could not have been more different, but I remember that we were standing on these rocks, kind of overlooking the water, and we were kind of psyching ourselves up, and we were going to jump in. And so we yelled, okay, 1, 2, 3, and then we jumped into the water. And I will always remember that moment. We were sort of splashing around in the water, and I looked around at these 19 new friends. And again, we couldn't have been more different, but we were all united by this idea that we were all change makers. We were all leading change from where we were. And even to this day, I still get some WhatsApp messages from them occasionally on our group chat. When I get that ping, I get this feeling of community and feeling like, oh, okay, I'm not alone in this. We're in this together. And it's more of a story than practical advice, I suppose. But I think each of us as changemakers need to find our own changemaker community. It could be fellow changemakers that are in the weeds with us. It might be a network of funders and supporters that will be with there to support us. But I think we tend to feel the pressure. We have to do it all by ourselves. But a big part of leadership, a big part of change making is inviting others to be in the change process with you. And so I encourage you more as a reflection to think about how you might bring others into the change and build that community if you don't have it already. Manaz asked which fellowship. And so yeah, the fellowship was called Youth Action Net.
Yes, that's a wonderful one. So thank you so much, Alex. And just I'll make a follow-up question comment. Then we have lots more questions coming in. And also just for your question, Bita, there are so many, there's a whole ecosystem now supporting change makers. And so there are funders, there's trainers, there's fellowship providers, networks. So if there's both local, regional, and global. So if you are not part of those networks, PCDN is one, takingitglobal.org, Idealist, I mean, they're all over the world. There's ones. So one of the best things you can do to not work in isolation is find the networks. And sometimes it's a LinkedIn group, it could be WhatsApp, but the EU does a lot of funding and training. So find the networks where people are, it's not only where they're doing the same thing as you, because it's really important to get outside of silos, but find the networks that are curating community, opportunities, and support. And so Alex, a follow-up question, and I'll try to make this very short. So I worked in the nonprofit sector forever, then in higher education 10 years full-time, now in social enterprise. And every sector has its challenges. And when I was in the nonprofit sector, I helped I started with colleagues, nonprofits. One of them, we got to a couple 100,000 in revenue. We thought we were going to change, and sorry, just hit the wrong thing in my screen. So we thought we were going to change the world and grow, and we saved up a lot of admin money. And then all of us were doing our PhDs, so we're doing research practice. We got contracts and foundation grants, and then as we finished our PhDs, we all went full time, and we're like, we're going to build the world, and we totally failed. So it wound up being full-time work for half-time pay with no benefits, and there was no one to blame because we were the team, and it still exists, but we didn't make it big. And a lot of people I know, and I've been on nonprofit boards where we get to 6 months in the year, we don't know if everyone's going to have money to pay the staff. But also, and PCDN purposely is not a nonprofit, it's a social enterprise, because we wanted to have sources of revenue that we could prove there's a community and people willing to pay for the services and things like that. It's a different model, it still has its challenges. But there is a little bit of idealization of social entrepreneurship, and everything should be for profit. And also, so what is your advice if someone is working in change making, both in terms of if they want to start their own thing or work for somewhere? How do they decide whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, foundation, both in terms of the career path, but also if they're going to start their own thing? What is your thoughts on that? Because I have a friend, I won't say who she's like, don't start a nonprofit. We need more social enterprises. And other people are like, no, we don't need social enterprises. We need more people in public policy. So just what are your thoughts on like that tension between all these different approaches?
Yeah, there's an article I love in Stanford's Social Innovation Review. It's called The Most Impactful Leaders You've Never Heard of. And what I love about it is that it teaches us something called network-based leadership, that we need to think about leading change through networks, that it's not just about doing everything ourselves, that we should be a node, not a hub. And oftentimes when we think about starting something new, we think we have to be the hub. We've got to do everything and have everything kind of revolve around us. But I think the best change makers will see themselves as a node. They'll understand what are other people working on. Again, just using climate justice as an example to think about, well, what are other people doing? Are there models in another part of the world I could adapt to my local community? Are there things going on in my local community where there's a gap that I could fill? Not trying to do everything myself, but a way that I could plug in. And I think sometimes if we focus more on that, we'll follow from there. Instead of saying, I've got to start a nonprofit, I've got to start a for-profit. Sometimes form matters a little bit less than the actual work that you do. I'd also say that the good news is it's a lot easier to have many different forms than it was in the past. With Start Some Good, we began as a US-based LLC. And the reason we did that is simply because it was cheaper and easier to get started. That's honestly the reason we started. We didn't put more thought into it. As we went along, we became a B Corp, which felt important to us to signify our social impact. But many of the entrepreneurs that I've worked with, they have hybrid organizations. It might be a for-profit that's owned by a nonprofit or vice versa. We've seen change.org evolve from being a traditional C Corp, kind of a high growth startup, to now being owned by a nonprofit entity. So there's a lot of different forms. And I would say we tend to get so focused on the form at the beginning that we can get paralyzed with action. And so I say have a bias towards action, trust that you'll figure out the right form as you go, but also try to think about how do I plug into what's already going on? Do we need another social enterprise? Do we need another nonprofit? Or are there ways you could find what people are doing and build off of that?
Okay, thank you so much. So wonderful advice. Lots of questions are coming in, so I'll jump, cut them and I'll get to yours, and also welcome people from Madagascar, Spain, and let us know. So Eva, this is, she's asking, how can we effectively motivate richer companies in the global north to support change making in poorer countries? So any thoughts both on if it's a global south change making organization, how to get more support from the global north, but also how to get regional or local support?
Yeah, thanks. And this ties a bit into Dr. Rojas's question as well. I'm a big fan of the book Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva. I think that's an absolutely game-changing book, all about the way that traditional foundations and other sort of do-good entities actually uphold many of the colonizing forms of wealth and wealth distribution. So I strongly recommend reading his book. Now, when it comes to like, how do we start changing those power paradigms? I think there's a couple of things we have to do. I'm not saying that it's easy because it's entrenched in a lot of these traditional power structures. But one is we've got to start trusting our local leaders on the ground rather than centralizing power at one headquarters somewhere, to start dispersing the power and the trust to those on the ground. I've learned that no one knows better what a community needs than the community itself. And we've got to start empowering people to make those decisions for themselves, to move from this idea of like, oh, I know what's best for you, to trust like, no, you actually know what's best for you. And we need to start changing that. And as we think about like sort of funding of those initiatives, whether that's like a corporate social responsibility type of thing, we've got to make sure that the makeup of our teams and our organizations becomes more diverse, and that we bring in some of those perspectives of folks on the ground too. So I don't have any easy answers. It's more of a theoretical answer, but strongly recommend Edgar Villanueva's terrific book, and that we've got to have change from within the systems as well. We can't just put Band-Aids on cuts. We've got to actually affect systems change as well.
Yeah, so his work is amazing, and you can follow Decolonizing Philanthropy. It's a whole movement where they're doing a lot of capacity building and funding directly to BIPOC populations. And then also, I can never pronounce Anand's last name, but Winner Takes All is a very interesting and provocative reading. He's coming out with a new book next month on a different topic, but it's Winner Takes All. It really critiques the philanthropic capitalism industry, and says basically that what we need is more taxes and more public policy, but it's a whole nother discussion. So Catalina, Dr. Rojas has a great question, which I think you're addressing some, but how to decolonize change. So I think, she says as micro leadership's fine, but what about the larger systems? And she knows this is not easy as a woman of color living in the global South, but she has to ask.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate that. I saw you also asked another question, which is about the tension between structural change and micro everyday change. That's one of the things that I see a lot in my students as well. So I developed a tool, which is called the Changemaker Canvas. If you want to take a look, it's changemakerbook.com/canvas. And so this is based on what I learned working with thousands of changemakers around the world that want to affect change. And that it can so often feel overwhelming that we just don't know where to start, that it feels like, to even affect change, how do I possibly begin? And so the Canvas is a tool which helps you break complex and even overwhelming change down into small and actionable steps. If you've used something like the business model Canvas before, it'll feel comfortable to you. And so in this Canvas, one of the things that I do is we spend time really trying to understand the problem. There's a quote which is often attributed, but it may be inappropriately misattributed, but to Albert Einstein. And so whether he said it or not, it's a great quote. The quote says, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. And I think that as change makers, we tend to feel pressure to jump right into action. But I want to encourage change makers to slow down a little bit and understand the problem deeply. And so I break the problem down into 3 parts. The first is the core problem. What's the core problem that you yourself are addressing right now? Not in 10 years, not in 15 years. Like, what are you doing right now? The core problem you're trying to solve, and for whom? Then from there, we need to recognize the consequences. So if this problem is unaddressed, what might happen as a result in 5 or 10 years, both at an individual level and perhaps at a societal level? By differentiating between the core problem and the consequences, we can know, okay, this is the core problem we're working on, and then these are the ramifications. Rather than trying to change things on the downstream, we can actually focus on like where we can control things. But then the third and most important is systems change. What are the root causes causing this core problem in the first place? These could be social, historical, cultural, economic, technological. These are the underpinnings that lead us to have the problem in the first place. Now, in most cases, it's very hard to affect the core problem and systems change at the same time. But if you deeply fall in love with a problem that you feel like I just have to solve, well, then great, you've identified what some of those root causes are. And that's where the systems change comes in. So in my opinion, it's not an either or, it's a both and. You may start with the core problem, but you've got to think about what are some of those root causes as well. I'm really inspired by the work that an organization I got to know in Sweden does. They're called Barnrättsbyrån. Craig, you asked if I know any Swedish, and I would say lite, and not very much Swedish, but just enough. It's called Barnrättsbyrån, or Children's Rights Bureau. And they're a great example of this. They work with the most marginalized children to make sure that their rights are respected. Again, Sweden has pretty good human rights, pretty good children's rights, but not every child knows that. When I was working with them in 2015, there were a number of unaccompanied youth refugee children coming over, at that time especially from Syria and Afghanistan. And so these children don't necessarily know all of their rights. So Barnrättsbyrån advocates for them. They make sure that no children fall through the gaps, that they advocate for each child, their own individual needs, social welfare, lawyers, etc. So they help on the individual kind of core issue of making sure children at an individual level get their rights respected. But then here's where it gets interesting. They also start seeing patterns. Because they support so many children, they're able to see, well, what's going on at a state or even national level? What are some of the issues that we're seeing? And then based off of what they learn on individual cases, then they lobby and push for change at a systems level as well. So they focus on the individual child, making sure that they get what they need. But then they take those lessons and they apply them at the national level to try to affect policy change. And I think that combination is really powerful. It's deep impact, changing the lives of those individual children, but also big scale, being able to affect change at the nationwide level as well.
Thank you so much. So more questions are coming in, and we have people from Ghana. I don't think we have anybody from Australia or New Zealand or Japan, but just a couple of key fellowships. So again, there are so many professional and academic and short-term. So you can find a lot on PCDN, Rotary, the Peace Fellowship, they have other fellowships. a friend of mine founded profellow.com. It's the world's best database for fellowships, both academic and professional. The Knight Hennessy Fellowship, which is for master's and PhD graduate programs at Stanford, funded by Phil Knight, the founder of Nike. Atlas Core is a great one. We partner a lot with social entrepreneurs from around the world who come to the US and they work. It's a professional fellowship. So it's not, there's too many things where we'll come to the US and we'll teach you how to do things. This is no, come to the US and work in partnership with organizations. The Mandela Fellowship, which is funded by Department of State. So there are so many fellowships out there. You have to learn how to apply for them, but that's one of the things. So Bineta, I'll get to your question. Please keep the questions coming. We have about 15 more minutes, and let us know also if you haven't, where you're watching from. So Bineta saying, yes, she's trying to change the field by giving. Bineta, can you let us know where you're watching from? And maybe, so she's trying to change the field by giving back to her community. And it gets frustrating because a lot of international organizations come in, they implement a project where locals might be filling staff roles or potential beneficiaries, but then they often stop. So any thoughts about that? I mean, there's so much talk about localization, and I think Samantha Power at USAID is doing better than previous administrators, but like most funding in the international development industry, which is not always the same as the change-making industry, still tends to go to global nonprofits and contracting firms. Despite all the, I think the staffing has changed some degree where it's less likely to have a deputy chief of party or chief of party as an expat, much more it's regional or local. But any thoughts? And among the change-making institutions, who do you think is doing the best at putting local innovation, expertise, and knowledge and supporting global South-South exchanges?
Oh, it's so important. I mean, I'll give a shout out to Reach for Change, the organization that I work for, which focuses on local leaders, local solutions. It's based in Stockholm, but with offices in a number of different countries, including the global South. I think they do a good job of not being sort of top down, but rather bottom up. But I think you're right. I think many organizations need to have this type of change, and we're absolutely not there yet. There's a paper that I love written by Joanna C. and Jess Remington, which is called Designing with the Beneficiary. I think there's a bad habit in sort of traditional elite bubbles, whether that's consulting firms or academia, which is like, oh, well, we become the experts and we figure out what to do. And we design for the beneficiary. But they make a really compelling case talking about why it's crucial to design with the beneficiary. And so change those power dynamics. We're not there yet. I think there's a lot of change that needs to happen. So I see you and I totally agree with you. But that's one paper that I think is an important one that more people should read.
Okay. So welcome Maria Elisa from Colombia, and again, people from all over the world. And Catalina and I do small scale angel investing, small scale, and it's social impact startups, and we're married in full transparency, and we work together. So one of the ways of, and I've been on lots of boards, I try to push for localization. And lots of times when people ask me potentially to do a consultancy, I'm like, I don't know anything about that country, region. And often I'll say, here's 5 local or regional people I know who could do it better, cheaper, and more effectively. So that's something, but there's still the systems still tend to put a priority. It's changing on, let's say, global North expertise. So in angel investing, Kata will always look, I'll say, this is a brilliant idea. And she'll be like, it's a bunch of white guys, investors, or where's the diversity, or, what's the inclusion model? Or, so it's, part of it is also if you're in any position of authority of allocating resources or making, and I do a lot of fellowship reviews. So if you're in any position of influence, to also ask those questions about who's benefiting from this and is this representative? So another hard question from Kata comes, and thank you, someone posted the article, it's on LinkedIn, so you can find it. Thank you, I don't see your name, just as LinkedIn user. So Catalina is asking another hard question, how about we need the opposite of change? So this is a great one, thinking about the global backslide in rights and economic justice, where there are lots of people in the US, who, our state of residence in the US is Florida. We live in Colombia, and Florida is seeing huge backslides on women's rights, reproductive rights, immigrant rights, voting rights. So Kata is saying, some people want to do change, and change is not the same to everybody. So basically, how do you balance when someone's version of change, at least to a certain population of people, is inherently anti-democratic and repressive? So how do you work around that? And, it's a hard question.
Yeah, but an important one. The way I look at change is that change itself is value neutral. It's a bit like technology. Technology can be used for really good things and also for really bad things. And so same thing with the concept of change. Now, when you layer on the idea of being a change maker, then I think we apply some things which are lenses of seeing the world and seeing change. So, for instance, I think embedded in being a change maker are themes like empathy and equality and justice. So I would differentiate between change and change making. Now, when it comes to sort of democratic backsliding, among other issues, I still think that the toolkit of a change maker is essentially the same, whether that's trying to affect change or to uphold, sort of protect existing aspects of change. So we still need resilience. We still need flexibility. We still need adaptability. We still need micro leadership. We just apply them in a slightly different context. But yeah, it's important to recognize that change is not appreciated by everyone in the same way. There's negative externalities from change. But I think change itself is value neutral. It's all about how we lead change, what we do with that change. And that's something that I think we have the potential to control as change makers.
So one quick question I'll ask, then I can see one came in from Everin, and we have about 10 more minutes of people. So what do you advise people? Because when, we do a lot of career advising in PCN in my professoring role, and for example, help run a master's in conflict resolution. There's not that many jobs in peace building and conflict resolution. They've grown. And so lots of my alum, work for Mercy Corps or the UN or, really good Catholic Foundation, great international NGOs and institutions. But sometimes I would get more excited when an alum went to work for an oil company or a financial firm, because there's a whole question, like, is it better? How does someone decide if you want to work to change a system from within, whatever that institution be, whether it's military, financial, to advocate for change a little bit on the outside? If you think of stakeholder engagement associations, whether it's the UN Global Compact or Principles of Responsible Investment, or to say the system is so distraught and dysfunctional that it's better to do radical advocacy. I'm not talking about revolution, but radical advocacy, and just say this is not working. So how do you, both in your own career, how have you decided whether to be in a little bit apart or radically outside the system? And you use in your book, I forgot the term, but working on the margins or the fringes, I forgot the term. And then for people thinking about their career, how do you advise? And again, it's a personal decision, but should they join, big horrible financial companies or Meta, or should they go in the system and try to do change, or how does someone engage in those difficult decisions?
It's such a great question, one that is a very popular one in my office hours, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. A couple of frameworks that I think are helpful. The first is I love the way that my friend Jocelyn Ling Milan talks about this. She says, you should see your career as a series of hypotheses to test. So rather than thinking I could know exactly what I want to do coming out of undergraduate or graduate school or a pivot in my career, instead think about it as a series of hypotheses. Do I want to work for a big company or a small grassroots NGO? Do I want to work in a big city or rural? Do I want to be remote or in person? There's all these questions, and none of them are right or wrong. They're hypotheses to test. And so you set out trying to see how one of those resonates with you. And then rather than saying, okay, this doesn't feel right, I failed. No, you just validated your learning. You decided, no, I don't want to be at a big company. I'm more effective when I'm advocating on the outside. Well, great, then go for that. Because the thing is, the world needs each of us to lead change from where we are. There's a place for both of them. And you need to figure out where you can be most effective. I'm also inspired by the work of Darius Graham, a great changemaker I feature in the book. So Darius, to me, is a terrific example of being clear on his why, but flexible on his how. So his why is that he believes that there are all the resources we need to solve our society's problems out there, but a huge mismatch in the allocation of resources, that we need to get more resources in the hands of those more directly affected by the change. And so he spent his entire career trying to affect that change, but he's done so in very different ways. He got started as a lawyer at a fancy law firm and started doing some work and tried to really understand, why are those systems so imbalanced? Why is there such a mismatch? From there, he founded a grassroots organization, a social enterprise called the DC Social Innovation Project, which provided microgrants, about $500 to local DC-based grassroots organizations that just needed to get off the ground. From there, he pivoted to join Johns Hopkins University and ran their social innovation lab. When he did that, he did something quite revolutionary, which is that Johns Hopkins is, of course, a wonderful university, a bit excluded from the traditional community in Baltimore. So he said, okay, we're going to run an incubator, but we're going to invite members of the Baltimore community to be part of this alongside Johns Hopkins students. He did that for a few years. Then he pivoted to work for a foundation, the Weinberg Foundation, leading up programming in Baltimore. And he even served on the board of the Baltimore Art Museum, where he affects change through his board work. And so what's, I think, really inspiring about Darius's example is that he's remained clear on his why, but so flexible on his how. He's pursued that why through a big traditional law firm, a grassroots social enterprise, a university, a foundation, and a board service. He's made clear on the why, but done it in a number of different ways. And so perhaps for you, it's getting clear on what your why is. Is it fighting for racial justice or climate justice or educational equality? Whatever it is, find out what your why is, and then use the ideas from Jocelyn Ling Milan to test some hypotheses and see what's the most effective way to do it. You won't know until you get in there, but think like a scientist and explore, is this a change I want to be creating, and am I being effective in it?
So wonderful discussion. And Rohit Talwani, I don't know his last name, is a futurist who forecasts that the average millennial or the next generation on is going to have often between 12 to 20 jobs, for some even 40 jobs. So it's also taking off the pressure. I mean, if you want to be a medical doctor, engineer, or civil service, that might be a little different. But for most careers, you're going to have a series of jobs that add up over time, and you're going to float in and out of sectors and different types of employers. So I think focus on the change you want to affect now, and then being curious what comes next. And I just shared a colleague of mine from Georgetown, Mark Howard, does amazing work. I mean, it's an interesting example of change making. So he's an academic. While he was at Georgetown, he did a law degree as a professor, and one of his best friends was imprisoned for murder, wrongly imprisoned, and got out. It's on Oprah, you can find it. And he's built this entire project at Georgetown called the Prison and Justice Project. So they're doing college education inside of jails, but also doing almost like the Innocence Project, helping people get out of jail, and working with Kim Kardashian. But it's a really interesting thing. Like, he's in the system, but he's leveraging the power of academia and others to changing the criminal justice system in the US, but he's doing radical change. And it's just an example that came to mind. So we have a couple more minutes for questions. So Eva Rain has another question, which I think is a little bit similar to the previous question of how to get more support. Actually, I think we already did this question. This is a repeat, I think. So let me skip that one. So Catalina has a question. So, in terms of, did this book exist before you started teaching the course as a concept, or you taught the course and then the book germinated through that?
Yeah, I'm a reluctant author. I'm more of an entrepreneur than an author. And so I didn't set out to write the book. But I had so many students tell me how the class was life-changing and that it had to become a book. And after enough people told me that, I figured, okay, well, maybe I should actually write the book to get the lessons out. I'm very inspired by the idea that changemakers are everywhere. And so I didn't want the lessons to just be at UC Berkeley. But then life sometimes has fortuitous timing. So in the same month that I signed with a literary agent, we also found out that my wife, Rebecca, was expecting our first child. And that puts a whole different perspective on how you kind of think about life and supporting change makers. And I also recognize that, well, I'm probably never going to have more free time than the next 7 months of my life. And so I dedicated a lot of those 7 months before my little guy arrived to write as much of the book as I could. But then also on the question of like, how did I finish it? What motivated me to finish it? It's just this idea of mission, because writing a book is really hard. They don't tell you going into it how hard it is. But I'm so mission driven and really want to get these ideas out to as many people as possible that I think that's what kept me going over the late nights and the early mornings and the struggling over how to get one paragraph to just right. Was thinking about getting this book in the hands of as many people as we could. And that's why it's such a joy to now have the book 2 weeks old out into the world, and to hopefully in the hands of many of members of your community as well.
Thank you, Alex. So I think I'll ask one more question, and I'll see if, feel free to put any other last minute questions. And thank you everyone for joining us. Actually, I'm going to ask 2 questions. So one is, social impact work is a long, hard slog. I mean, it really is. And there's a lot of incredibly inspiring moments and brilliant people and organizations, but it's hard. So what is your advice, either from your own experience or people you've worked with? And you talk about in your book how to stay resilient, particularly when so much of resilience is put on the individuals, because the systems are often not designed to support time off or parental leave or just like downtime. So how do you balance, like, the world is so messed up and we've got to make change, but also not totally burning out? So what, either from the stories you researched or the people like, who's doing it right and what are your recommendations? Because I've burnt out multiple times, and particularly I've seen bright-eyed graduate students go off into the world to dangerous situations, and they don't understand the complexities or the challenges or the aid or change bureaucracy, and they can have meltdowns, or there can be really dangerous situations or just demoralizing. So
yeah, so important. And I've burned out myself with my own social enterprise work, so I feel that. I think I'll go back to the wise words of my friend and amazing changemaker, Sid Espinoza. Sid is the first ever Latino mayor of Palo Alto, California, and the former VP of philanthropy at Microsoft. He's currently leading up social impact at GitHub. So he came to speak to my students, and a student asked him almost exactly that question, like, hey, there's so much change I want to create in the world. How do I not burn out? And it just feels so overwhelming. And so he said something which has really stuck with me and really resonated with so many of my students. This idea that we've got to stop thinking about change making or social impact as an individual sprint, that it's up to us to solve everything by ourselves. But instead, we need to start thinking of it as a relay race, that our job is to take the baton from those who have come before us and then advance the baton as far as we can in the time we have, whether that's a year, 10 years, 30 years, 50 years. Our job is to move that baton forward as much as we can. But then it's not enough to just hand the baton off to the people that will come after us, but to make sure we're good stewards, to make sure that we support them, that we mentor them, that we nurture them, that we set them up for success as well. To move from thinking about what can I do in my own individual race to how can I be part of this relay race and move us collectively forward. That's an analogy that has really inspired me and many of my students, and I think that could be helpful to your community as well.
Okay, wonderful. So 2 more questions came in, but I'll just give a quick quote. Our friend Flynn Coleman, who is one of the world's experts on AI and human rights, has given talks for us. It's a great book she wrote called A Human Algorithm, and it's an optimistic view of AI, and her basic urging is that if everyone, artists, change makers, policymakers, humanities, people don't get involved in AI and understand and help shape it, then it's going to shape us. We all need to be engaged. But she has a very powerful quote, which basically is hope is our resistance. Because we asked her a very similar question, and she's like, I just have to, I know most of the things that she is working on in her lifetime will not be adequately addressed, but she just like doing the action is providing hope that there is some opportunity for a better future. So 2 more. Kata has a question, which I think we've talked about some, but particularly when you think about advising younger professionals, let's say from 19 to 25, 30, and they're trying to say, should I undertake grad school? Ideally at low cost if they have a fellowship, or do it. But is it worth doing grad school, or just go out and build and experiment and iterate? And obviously it's a personal choice, but how do you advise younger professionals?
Yeah, ultimately it is just such a personal choice, but I'll just share a couple of principles I think are helpful. So Craig, I totally agree. Whatever you can possibly do to not go into debt, it's almost certainly not worth the high levels of debt that so many, especially in the United States, take on, which just limits your options, your career choices, and can feel so overwhelming. So almost across the board, wouldn't recommend it if it's coming at a huge personal cost. But then from there, I think the most important thing is that there is a lot of pressure. I see this among my high achieving Berkeley students. They feel like I've got to do grad school. It's just like the next step I've got to. But I would say don't do it for that reason. Make sure you have a really clear why in terms of why you're doing graduate school. One thing that I found, I did a Master of Public Policy degree at Georgetown, and I found that on average, the more experienced folks were, the better reason they had to be in graduate school, the more they got out of it. So I only had 1 year of work experience before joining graduate school, and I think I didn't get a ton out of it. But those that had more experience in their career, 7, 8, 10 years, they seemed to really know why they were there, and they made the most out of it. So I think make sure you have a really clear why in doing it, and you're not just doing it for the pressure of it. But I'm also inspired by the new models that are being developed. So whether that's executive education programs, certificate programs, short-term learning programs, there are a lot more options now than there were 5 or 10 years ago. Now, some of them you might say, well, a certificate doesn't come with the same social proof as a master's degree. Sure, fair enough. But you should consider all options in terms of what is the learning that you want and how much of it is the credential that you want, and balance those two as you make your decision. Because it may be that you need more education, you need more training, but it might be that formal graduate school isn't the right path.
Okay. So just I'm sharing a few things. So one is I was fortunate to have a lot of fellowships just because I had good mentors. So Central European University is really good, globally recognized university in Austria, and they have bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and they have a lot of funding. Rotary Peace Fellowship, Notre Dame advertises they're a client, so in full transparency, but they have full funding for their masters for all over the world in their international peace studies and PhDs. Nextford, again, I'm a brand ambassador, but they have some really interesting experimental programs, and Minerva University, and then Amani Institute, was on the advisory board. So there's a lot of other interesting social, or Atlas Core. There's so many opportunities out there. So I think the last comment, and before I wrap up, comes from Benita. Thanks again for all your comments and questions. And again, you're in New York, but from Senegal. So just saying, like, if you have any comments, basically you have to have like the compelling why to stay motivated. And any thoughts? She has a master's degree in international development, has a lot of debt from that, but it hasn't given her the job. So I've done a lot of research on the gap between higher education, particularly grad programs, and the employment market. So people can message me, I can share those publications. But any thoughts on that? Particularly like when people choose or are encouraged to take on expensive programs, and that debt could limit their career and life choices.
I mean, it's obviously a personal decision, so I'd never go so far to tell someone what to do. But that in general, of the people I know, the changemakers I've worked with, the less debt you have, or ideally no debt, the more opportunities that you have. And so usually it's just not worth taking on that debt. But I say that with humility because everyone's situation is different. And so I don't want to tell anyone what to do, but that's just a pattern that I've seen.
I mean, Kata just says we talk a lot about grad school, and again, Pro Fellow is a great place as well. I don't have, Vicki Johnson's, and she's traveling around the country the next few weeks just doing workshops. And then again, there's so many Schwartzman Fellows. The deadline just passed, but there's so many fellowships out there. And I think just one point I'll make: if you're gonna, I mean, obviously I taught full-time at university for 10 years. I still teach. If you're gonna take on debt, just understand what the degree will give you, how supportive the program is in building your skills, talk to the alumni, and then do the calculation of the alternatives to grad school, because it can be a really good choice. But just make sure you understand. And also, if you are a strong candidate and apply to enough programs, often you can get some partial funding or full funding, whether it's Fulbright or the Marshall Fellowship or DAD from Germany. I did my master's at CEU 1 year. I had a tuition fellowship, so I had no debt. So it's like do things as long as they're credible. That for my PhD, I had full funding at multiple places. I went to places with no funding. They didn't give me any money. My ego was hurt. So I came out with about $20,000 in debt, but it was affordable, and it was the right choice for me. So last two questions is just, if people want to engage with you or learn more about your work, obviously check out the book, follow your website, follow you on, do you have a favorite channel? Is it LinkedIn, Twitter? Like, where do you encourage, where you post the most, where people might learn about your work?
Yeah, LinkedIn is by far my favorite platform. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. Would love to engage with you there. And yeah, check out the book, changemakerbook.com.
And then what type of, obviously you're quite busy teaching, researching, parenting. Congrats, by the way. So how could people help you in your work? I mean, are you looking for places for the student? Like, are you looking for people to come to executive education? Obviously you want people to use and give you feedback on the book. But are there any kind of asks you have of whoever is watching this now or might listen to this in the future?
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah, for sure. The number one thing is check out a copy of the book, tell your friends about the book, invite them to read it with you in community. That's really my focus right now, is putting all the magic of the class into this book. And it's so much hard work to write a book. And I would love for it to reach as many people as possible. And there's no better way to find out about books than word of mouth. So if you feel inspired by this, if you give it a read yourself, tell your friends about it. That would mean so much to me to help create the world that we need, which is a world that's filled with change makers.
And then last question. So for people who read your book and are not located in the Bay Area, not close to UC Berkeley, do you offer, I mean, obviously you're giving lots of talks so people could follow you on LinkedIn and see where your next webinar, but do you offer any kind of structured kind of training or educational support for changemakers, or it's only at UC Berkeley? Or if not, where else do you recommend people go, like, to kind of dive into this in more depth?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, the book is trying to make it accessible to more folks around the world. So I don't have a formal training at this point, but the book is really the best of what I know. But if you need more, feel free to reach out to me and let's explore what we can do. But I would say, please start with the book and see if that gets you part of the way that you need on your changemaker journey.
Okay. And the book, you can go to changemakerbook.com, or do you have any preferred bookseller where you would prefer people to buy it?
It's accessible, anywhere that you like to buy books. So Amazon is, of course, easy, but not always the most values aligned. So Amazon's a possibility. Bookshop.org if you want to support your local bookshop. But really, anywhere that you buy books, I'm super grateful for you doing so.
So John from University of Vermont is thanking you for a second time since you gave, and then just show you a couple of the comments. Mina is thank. So we're going to end here. Our next podcast will be October 6th with an educational innovator from Colombia who actually was trained as an engineer but has moved into education for social impact. And then at the end of October, we're going to have a founder from Singapore who's got a really interesting startup. I'm going blank on the name, but basically a well-being startup. He worked at Google and Twitter and all the places and just saw this gap around well-being. So that'll come up, so just follow us on our channels. And thank you so much, Alex. Congrats both on the book and the new child. It is a process of birthing a book, and as a parent, I know they're both, as a both parent and author, I know they're both exhausting but incredibly inspiring. So everyone, please share this. This will be on LinkedIn, YouTube, so you can share this video. And again, in about 2 weeks, this will be out on our podcast. So we have 100 other plus episodes with changemakers from all over the world. So also please consider rating our podcast, but also buy the book or get your library to buy it and tell others about it. I'm skimming it. I haven't fully read it, but it's amazing. So please, encourage people to look at this and share it. And, if you have feedback, be in touch with Alex. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we will end